So markets normally provide us with the goods and services that we want, and they do a pretty efficient job at doing that. But occasionally we have to intervene in those markets, maybe because the goods are potentially harmful, or maybe because the goods could cause some damage to the environment, or we want to control certain sorts of services, and we do that by forms of regulation. There will generally be different processes of regulation throughout a life cycle because there will be different conceived harms. So if we think about working with stuff in a laboratory or working with stuff in a factory, we will be worried about things like worker exposure. That will give different rules to the rules that we put in place when something goes on a market. When something goes on a market, we may decide, do we want it labelled? Do we want it freely available for everyone who wants it? We will control the point of sale. After that, in use, very often products are not tightly regulated. Once we bought them, we can do what we like with them, but there will become a point of disposal. And the question is, and it's a very tricky question, how well do we cope with things at the end of their life?
So if we think about how nanomaterials are regulated at different points in the life cycle, in an occupational setting, there are limits to how much dust an individual can be exposed to. At the moment, there are no nano-specific regulations for occupational settings. There are new regulations for consumers which require cosmetics companies to label their product about whether they contain nanomaterials or not. For the Environment Agency and organisations like DEFRA provide advice and support to companies about how they can deal with nanomaterials and release them or dispose of them, but at the moment there are very few strict regulations in that area.
So when we decide we need regulation, that regulation has to be written into legislation, written into law. However, because very often we're dealing with products, and because products are supposed to freely cross the European market, very much of this legislation is not UK legislation, it's EU legislation.
The European Chemicals Agency uses a process known as REACH, which is a regulation of chemicals and hazardous substances. It's a series of guidelines that companies have to abide by and provide information to ECHA when their substance or nanomaterial achieves a certain volume on the European market. If they feel they don't have enough information to make a well-informed decision about the use of that product, then they can put in place some embargoes or some controls about how that substance is used.
When the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering looked at this in 2003, they suggested a hiatus on using nanomaterials for environmental cleanup. And since that time, that moratorium, as it's called, has been in place. Interestingly, it's not in place everywhere. It's not in place in the USA, it's not in place in Germany.
Probably the most important gap when it comes to regulating nanomaterials in consumer products and in the environment is being able to identify nanomaterials in those complex substances or complex mixtures. They're so small, they're really difficult to detect. Therefore, it's difficult for regulators to find out exactly how much nanomaterial is included in a product, what it is, and then how it's disposed of.
There is only so much that Britain or even the European Union can do, because the development of nanomaterials will go on a global scale. They will be produced in products that will be used in other countries and other environments. They may make their way into the market, but it is important, if they're entering the European market, that European regulation applies to them.